I found the last few discussions absolutely compelling. Very, very interesting indeed. And we're now going to continue this theme, talking about cyber and the changing face of modern conflict, which is going to be moderated by Niloofar Razi Howe, who is also from Vanderbilt, a distinguished visiting professor, but whose own career, if you look in the biography, exemplifies the type of public-private partnerships that have been so much at the center of the discussions today. So, over to you, Niloofar.
Thank you so much. Here we go. I'm used to being mic'd. Thank you so much, Jillian. I'm so thrilled to be having this conversation today about cyber and the changing face of modern conflict. You guys have heard it today. It's just not possible to talk about China or strategic competition without talking about the different elements of cyber and how it impacts that relationship. And we're going to cover some of the topics that you may have heard about already today, but we're going to talk about them in a little bit more in depth with this incredible panel of experts who we have. So I'd like to first introduce them. Khaleel, sitting at the end, is the Associate Laboratory Director for the National Security Sciences at Oak Ridge National Labs, and he guides the research and development of science-based solutions to counter critical threats to public safety, national defense, energy infrastructure, and the economy. So that's a pretty big and important portfolio. Next to him, we have Robyn Klein, who is Dr. Robyn Klein, who's the Director of Cyber Policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where she leads the development and implementation of U.S. DoD strategy and guidance to address foreign malicious cyber threats, enabling military campaigns and contingency planning. Previously, Dr. Klein served on the National Security Council as a Director of Weapons of Mass Destruction and Terrorism Threats. Next to Robyn, we have Major General Lorna Mahlock, who assumed her current duties as commander of the Cyber National Mission Force in January of this year. Prior to her current assignment, she served as the National Security Agency's Cybersecurity Directorate Deputy Director for Combat Support. Major General Mahlock was born in Kingston, Jamaica, immigrated to Brooklyn, and enlisted in the Marine Corps. She was selected for the Marine Corps Enlisted Commissioning Education Program in 1991, and the rest, so to speak, is history. And finally, we have Thompson Paine, who leads product management strategy business operations for Anthropic, a frontier AI research lab with safety, research and deployment at scale as its core mission. He's also a member of the adjunct faculty here at Vanderbilt. So I think we have a great representation of cross-section of Department of Defense, national labs, intelligence community, and the private sector. So I want to start by turning into the title of this panel, which is Cyber and the Future of Conflict. In the early days of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, many pundits posited that cyber war was simply not playing an important role in the conflict. Of course, that point of view ignored the months of sleepless nights that Ukrainian cyber defenders, together with their coalition partners, their hunt forward operators, as well as the private sector incident responders and tech companies spent defending against Russian cyber operations, starting long before Russian soldiers set foot on the ground in February 2022. As the extent of these cyber operations became better understood, the perspective shifted. So Robyn, starting with you, can you set the context for us as you look at these recent conflicts, whether it's Russia-Ukraine or Israel-Hamas? How has cyber impacted modern conflict?
Sure, thanks, Nilu. First, a personal point of privilege. I always caveat when I talk about Russia-Ukraine, the lessons that we can learn from it. The public reporting indicated that Putin believed this would be a very short-term conflict, and the Ukrainians, to the degree leading up to the conflict, expected the invasion that was to follow, that was on a shorter timeline, according to public reporting. So the degree to which going into conflict, cyber was integrated into war planning on either side, I think we should caveat our expectations as how this would play out for a different type of conflict, perhaps that wasn't potentially longer term in duration and subject to more planning. I also want to make clear that when we talk about cyber and conflict, we're talking about a variety of different things. We could be talking about cyber espionage, cyber attacks, so cyber effects, and we could be talking about cyber-enabled information warfare. But to Nilu's point, I think that despite the predictions of cyber war, what we are seeing is cyber in a conflict. And so how we judge the role of cyber in this conflict, I think, provides some interesting insights. One that I would suggest is there is no cyber silver bullet. We haven't seen that play out. That doesn't mean that there aren't impactful cyber operations that are conducted, but I think some of the predictions, maybe looking back 10 years ago, are not bearing fruit in the conflict, that there will be a cyber silver bullet. I also would point out that cyber is hard. So cyber options, opportunities, they don't fall off a conveyor belt the same way that ammunition can be produced. So we have to consider what we're talking about, whether it's from an espionage standpoint, cyber attack standpoint, or other. But when I look at Russia, I think about how their use of cyber in this conflict demonstrates that they don't care about blowback. To me, what we see is a country unlike ours, where we promote the voluntary peacetime norm of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. The Russians we've seen, whether it's kinetic attacks, but certainly also involving cyber, they are conducting attacks against distinctly, exclusively public targets, services to the public in particular, which is not how I think, from a war planning standpoint, that is not how the Department of Defense focuses its efforts. So that's an interesting insight about a country like Russia, how they are willing to use cyber. On the Ukraine side, I think what we have seen is a tech-savvy workforce, not just limited to cyber, but certainly also including cyber, that where they lack the production scale on the Russian side, they have come up with innovative solutions to technological problems, which has benefited them in cyberspace and beyond. I think for the Ukrainians as well, what we've seen play out is excellent resilience on their part. I think that is a reflection not only of the Ukrainians' commitment to enhancing their cyber resilience, but the work of commercial firms working with the Ukrainians, U.S. and partner countries, and so they have been able to weather and continue the fight despite Russian efforts. A few other quick points. I think in the conflict, we have seen the role of non-state actors or entities playing out on both sides, which introduces some interesting dynamics into the role of cyber in conflict. And I think the additional point of judging the success of success of the integration of cyber with other tools of national power in the war context, the question remains whether we've got the cocktail mixed right, whether it's on the Russian side or the Ukrainian side, and the importance of being able to do that so that it's not just a one and done kind of employment of cyber in wartime, but it is integrated in a fashion where, together with other aspects of power, makes sense and produces a result that is measurable and distinct.
Thank you, Robyn. You touched on a lot of points that we're going to dig into in a little bit. General Mahlock, you're the commander of the Cyber National Mission Force, and while you took over in January, which is only a few months ago, you were with the Cybersecurity Directorate. What about for the folks who are actually running these hunt forward missions and supporting our allies in times of conflict. What's the reality, the ground truth, in terms of the role of cyber in warfare?
So, Nilu, and frankly, the entire Vanderbilt team that put this together, I just want to say thanks. What you're going to hear from me is, our commander who's really, really excited about the mission that we have, and the warfighters and civilians that help us, and frankly, our industry partners that helped us position our ally, Ukraine, to succeed against the Russians, at least to continue to persist against the Russians. What we did earlier, you heard General Hawk talk about it, was how intelligence drove some of the successes that you're hearing about, at least on the Ukrainian side. What we're learning from a Russia-Ukraine perspective is the power that, we don't talk a lot about that, but the power of the work that we did early on the defensive side, where Ukraine built that resilient ecosystem, working with commercial partners, right? Working with some of the non-traditional partners, and working with the United States. So from a cyber national mission force perspective, we have what we call Defend Forward, where we're building trust with partners, right? So we can operate in crisis at the speed of trust. We send, and I'll give you an anecdote. At the onset of Russia-Ukraine, we had young men and women on the ground in Russia. I'm sorry, in Ukraine. I hope they weren't in Russia. If they were, they didn't tell me. But they were on the ground in Ukraine. They were on the ground in Ukraine, and young officers and some civilians that we sent forward. And what they did was they identified indicators of compromise. And throughout the war, we've shared thousands of indicators, and we found and shared thousands of indications of compromise with industry partners, right? So we found them in Ukraine, and what we're able to do is work with industry and then protect, you heard General Hawk talk about this morning, the entire global ecosystem. And so we share this with partners who have apertures that see this threat in a different way than we do, right? And then we work with them to create the anecdote, right? Or the solution to the problem space, and then we lift the ecosystem for ourselves and our allies. So it's, what we're learning from Russia-Ukraine is you're going to see IO influence operations. You're going to see cyber used to enable those operations. You're going to see disinformation, and we're also seeing the rise of hacktivism. And so the technology has been democratized. The barrier to entry is really low, so everybody is going to come to the fight. On both sides of the equation, folks that are with us or against us. And so how do we, build, whether it's commercial industry, with our universities, with our partners and allies, build partnerships now, share technology with, based on our shared values to be able to operate at the speed of trust. And so for us, that's what we mean when we say we're doing campaigning with partners and allies and the U.S. government. It's about integrated deterrence. How do we stitch the mosaic together where we've got the entire fabric of our partners and allies using their authorities and our authorities to impose cost on our adversaries?
Thank you. And I just want to remind the audience that you can send in questions to the email address above, and I have my phone here that I'll check every once in a while. Thompson, you not only co-authored a paper on U.S.-China tech race for this other university on the West Coast that we won't name, but you also spent time as an exchange student studying law at Peking University. And so you have finger feel for how the Chinese think and the Chinese culture. What are the Chinese taking away from the recent conflicts? What are they learning?
I'm glad you mentioned my law school days. If anyone wants to talk about the connection between Marxist-Leninism and tort law, I'm happy to talk about it. I think I'm really going to echo a lot of what's already been said here. I actually love this idea of cyber weapons don't fall off the conveyor belt, and just the democratization of technology that we've seen in the Russia-Ukraine war. Just to couch this in the larger arc of the China CCP development model over the last several decades, China has a visceral connection, understanding of the connection between technological supremacy and national security. This goes back to the century of humiliation that they experienced from the Opium Wars up till 1949. And if you look back at, I'll plagiarize Evan Feigenbaum's research on China techno warriors, going back to the earlier nuclear program they had in the 1950s, they deeply, deeply understood this connection between economic development, national security, military security, and technological development. That was then accelerated even more emphasized in the first Gulf War, 1989, 1990, where they saw just how far out ahead the U.S. was to where China was militarily. And so China, you can bet that China is following the Russia-Ukraine conflict war, not closely just from a sanctions perspective in terms of how it might impact China if they take some somewhat analogous action, but also they are certainly following the technological developments here as well. And I do think the most interesting thing we are seeing is the cheap availability. It's almost like the first hackers war, the cheap availability of cheap technology that you can fold into a number of different kind of asymmetric investments. And I think asymmetric investments would be a word that would characterize a lot of China's military investments since 1989.
So touching on technology and innovation, Mo, our national labs are on the front line of really doing the deep research for next generation innovation. How are we adapting as we're learning from these conflicts and from what's going on the battlefield?
So a lot of the work at the national labs focus both on IT security and also cyber physical security. And in the U.S. national labs, we focus a lot on the electrical grid. The electrical grid is a fairly complex machine. There's about 3,000 companies operate the electrical grid, 55,000 substations. And then we added more complexity to it just recently with, the Inflation Reduction Act, Build Back Better, right, with all of the clean energy that we're trying to deploy. And so that actually increases the attack vector. So the U.S. national labs are focusing with the industry, working with the industry, focusing a lot on the back door, not the front door. I think our utilities are really pretty good at the IT security. We know about like the Colonial Pipeline, it was an IT type thing, but it's because of financial type issues, we ran into the problems we ran into. So we're focusing a lot on the back door. And so there's a lot of work we're doing in terms of standing up centers to look at the energy threat assessment, be able to detect malware or threats, cyber threats, share information with the utilities, and build mitigation strategies. We also, like at Oak Ridge, we're doing something in the Southeast, the Southeast Regional Cybersecurity Center, because a lot of times you can actually camouflage certain things depending on, say, weather issues you have with hurricanes, et cetera. So we're doing something like that in the Southeast. What we're hoping that will actually be expanded elsewhere. But there is a lot of other research activities that we're trying to do. I think earlier in the day, folks talk about, cybersecurity by design, resiliency by design. A lot of the automated detection and mitigation of cyber threats or also vulnerabilities. And also we're looking at post-quantum era and quantum key distribution. There's some really examples that the national labs are working together on it. And I think one of the important things is with these kind of threats, we need to think differently and work with each other different than the past, because we need to accelerate our technology development cycle and deployment of our efforts.
As you talk about IT networks, General Hawk this morning referenced the recent Chinese cyber operation Volt Typhoon, which targeted U.S. critical infrastructure. The NSA, CISA, FBI put out a joint advisory in February describing this operation as one where the People's Republic of China's state-sponsored cyber actors are seeking to pre-position themselves on IT networks for disruptive or destructive cyber attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure in the event of a major crisis or conflict with the U.S. So essentially, the PRC is prepping the battlefield with these types of operations. How vulnerable are we? And I'm just going to put this out to the whole group to see who wants to jump in and answer this question.
So, I'll start. I was a CIO for the United States Marine Corps, and then, my time at the cybersecurity directorate. I think we're we've got a ton of work to do, and that's what the Volt Typhoon activity highlighted for us, is that, you heard General Hawk talk about it this morning, the fabric along some of the IT, the OT, the ICS SCADA, it's aged. And what this Volt Typhoon activity, I don't know if our adversaries wanted this or not, but it has been a call to action across the United States government, and frankly, the U.S. writ large to move. And so, I mean, we can, some of these sector risk management areas, I mean, even energy, we're doing things now in terms of thinking about what do we do with the fabric that we have to become more resilient, right? And so the answer, the solution space is not just, buy new tech and more cyber, but how do we, if the power grid goes down, what is our alternative? And so you're seeing that across a lot of these sectors as we think about how we respond, because the objective of this Volt Typhoon and all the activity that we're seeing from the PRC is to really create, foment terror inside the United States as a part of their 3 strategies, right? To do information operations, to make sure that we never leave the shores of the United States. And so I think, there has been a ton of good work going on in terms of let's get our act in gear with industry partners. These partnerships that you're seeing that are coming out of this Volt Typhoon activity would have never happened a year ago or more, right? Where industry partners coming forward and saying, hey, look, we share data with them, not what we know, not how we know it, but what we know, and they provide us their intel, because I will tell you, there are companies out there that have mapped the globe and have data that we could not even begin to understand, because that's not our remit. And so when we put our data sets together with their data sets, we're better able to see our vulnerabilities. The other piece, Nilo, is now we know, right? A year ago, 2 years ago, we didn't know what the Chinese were doing in our infrastructure. So now that we know, what do we do? And that's build the right partnerships, build the right resilience to be able to persist against because again, it's we've talked about, Chancellor talked about this morning at breakfast, this idea of game theory of warfare. We've got to play to play, it's checkers and chess. We've got to play to play, we've got to play to win, right? But we've got to continue to play. So the game is both, another author has said, it's both finite and infinite. We have to do both.
Do we have a great sense of what the Chinese have remote access to, especially within the energy sector, and how has the energy sector responded to Volt Typhoon?
So I think, first of all, maybe we don't. There's a lot of hidden things when it comes to the operational technologies. So I think one can look at this from the utilities point of view. So our utilities, as I mentioned earlier, they postered their activities when it comes to IT, front door. They put a lot of effort there. But in terms of OT systems, a lot of the controllers, the SCADA system has a lot of, copyrights and so on, and that's fairly vulnerable. So, backdoor stuff is very important. There's a lot of things communicated through satellite, wireless communication, and also we need really to factor insider threat when we think about that. Somebody can camouflage, the control of you, or, plug a thumb drive into a controller and something like that. An important really thing that I really believe we're vulnerable quite a bit to it when it comes to, equipment that we put on the electrical grid. Now, a lot of the equipment suppliers are willing, for us collectively to look at their software and hardware. I think earlier in the day, somebody talked about the bill of materials for software and hardware. I think that's fairly important to be able to look at the provenance and the origin of every bit of code and every bit of hardware. Especially, when we look at what we deployed, in the electrical grid. We're going to put 500,000 EV chargers on the electrical grid. I think that, to me, is a huge, vulnerability for us. Now, in terms of, I think, a public-private partnership, the Department of Energy has been doing really a great job in trying to work with the utilities. I mentioned the example of ETech, but in terms of pushing research into real things. So out-of-band sensors is one of the areas we're working on at Oak Ridge and the side channel type thing. So being able, to look at all of these signatures and detect if there is a malware or not. Likewise, in terms of a heartbeat of some of these electronics, if you inject a signal on the, on one side, on the outside, on the output, you look at it, is it changing, is it not changing? I'm proud of the national labs working together with the utilities on being able to predict anomalies and things like that. So there's a lot of that is happening, but in all honesty, I think a big issue is the supply chain and our lack of understanding of everything about we're putting in our devices and so on. And again, the kind of what we have at the edge with our fridges, with all of the stuff we're putting on the edge, so that also increases the attack vector, and we really don't have a lot of solutions yet there.
I want to dive a little bit deeper into tech and innovation. General Hawk this morning had a great sentence. He said, "The fast will eat the slow," which I thought was exactly right, and it's just getting faster. And we've learned over the past decade that as the rate of tech innovation increases and accelerates, it's going to have a compounding effect. It's not just linear. And it's going to impact modern warfare. Peter Singer, who's our closing keynote speaker today, recently published an article in which he wrote, "In just the last few months, the battlefield has undergone a transformation like never before, with visions from science fiction finally coming true. Robotic systems have been set free, authorized to destroy targets on their own. AI systems are determining which individual humans are to be killed in war, and even how many civilians are to die along with them." And of course, in the article, he talks about Ukraine's use of the Sacred Scout quadcopters, which can find, identify, and attack Russian military objects on their own, as well as Israel's AI platform, which has 3 elements to it: the gospel, which considers millions of data items from everything from drone footage to seismic data, and marks buildings in Gaza for destruction from airstrikes. Lavender, which is another system, does the same thing for people, ingesting everything from cell phone to WhatsApp data and group membership to set rankings about how likely someone is to be a Hamas member or a Hamas leader. And all of this is tracked by a system called Where's Daddy, which sends a signal when they return to their homes where they can be bombed. So depending on the seniority of the particular Hamas leader, determines the parameters that are set for acceptable casualty rates. So Thompson, you've written about the U.S.-China tech innovation challenge. Can you set a context for us in terms of what's at stake here?
Yeah, it's hard to answer this question with not kind of talking about the AI space and where it's going. I don't know if you're ready for me to jump there, but I can maybe hold off a little bit.
We'll go there, I promise.
Okay, but again, not to be repetitive here, but I do think there is this visceral connection you see in the CCP between technological supremacy and national security. And whoever leads in next generation technologies will often lead not just economically, which, as we know, is a country that has had, at times a quarter of the world economy and 5% of the population, but has influence across the world that's more commensurate with the size of our economy than our population. If China's economy grows and they can lead technologically as well, that their influence across the world will grow too. And that's not even talking about military investments. Now, when your military reflects the latest advances in technology, you also have a leverage and an influence in the world that I think China wants to advance its interests in the same way that the U.S. has, or different way, but in the same vein that other countries do as well, including the U.S. And so I do think that's why this is so central to the competition today, and especially, and again, I'm biased here because I'm in this world with AI, it does feel like we are on the cusp of a generational change in technology. That we are moving into a new era with technologies like quantum, like AI, and so being at the forefront of that will determine who leads in the next chapter.
I just wanted to jump in on that point. I think it might have been the 2018 National Defense Strategy, if my memory is serving me correctly, but that said something to the effect of success will go not to the country that innovates technology, but to the country that is able to integrate the technology to its ability to fight. And so I would just note that technology innovation is happening all around us and at a rapid clip, and it is exciting and scary and all of that at the same time. But I think our ability to integrate it from a DoD standpoint, but it would apply across other sectors, economic sectors, et cetera, into our processes and our ability to prosecute whatever form the fight is taking place in is an important consideration. It is not available to every actor, every entity, every state that they can integrate effectively.
It's interesting that our allies are integrating and operationalizing these platforms before we have a need to do that. Do we have an asymmetric advantage? And if we do, what is our asymmetric advantage when it comes to innovation and technology?
So one of the things you heard from my boss this morning is, this idea of the partnerships that we've been developing with industry. That's our superpower, right? Our people are our superpower too, but the technical brains that we have, that this nation insources into the companies and the industry that we have is really our advantage. And so that's why you see the National Security Agency and Cybercom looking to where industry does technology development well. We're going to look to insource that technology to give us that first mover, that asymmetric advantage, because that's what we're seeing across, as you look at Russia, Ukraine, and Israel, Hamas. It's kind of a David and Goliath scenario in terms of Russia, Ukraine. How do you create an asymmetric advantage over an adversary who on the surface appears to have a better warfighting position, a more superior equipped army than you do? And so it's not fighting on the battlefield, it's fighting around all the other instruments of national power to be able to deliver the victory that, however we define victory today, right? Because it really is, it really has changed over time as to what we think victory is.
It's interesting because when, 5 years ago, if we talked about non-state entities, or non-state actors would be talking about terrorists. Today, there are non-state entities that we run operations on, and non-state entities we run operations with. And those entities can be individuals, billionaires who maybe have next-gen comms capabilities that they can deploy in wartime faster than large satellite companies can, or they can be our private sector, whether it's our tech companies, our incident responders, et cetera. How good are we in terms of partnering? We talk about public-private partnership. Probably every panel has talked about the importance of public-private partnership. It's becoming even more important as private sector is delivering warlike capabilities and doing things that used to be uniquely in the purview of governments to do.
Yeah, so just from our perspective, Morgan was up here today, and just, from my time over on the agency side, all the weapon systems that we build today are a computer, right? A submarine is a computer underwater, an airplane is a computer in the air, everything has a computer. So understanding that, we think it's we know it's really important to be able to get in a relationship with some of these companies. For example, you use the satellite analogy, but it's all the capabilities that we send to Ukraine. It's getting into a relationship with that company to help that company understand its vulnerabilities, left of the threat. So when we are on the battlefield, we are intimately familiar with the vulnerabilities of that system because we know the adversary is going to exploit it. And so that's the relationship that we see in either building new capability, but if the capability is aged, we get in a relationship with that partner to go, how do we protect? What are the vulnerabilities in your system? So when we're using it on the battlefield, like Russia, there's a number of systems, of partners, of companies that we've, entered into relationships with, enable the partner to, one, protect, their company in terms of you're not seeing that company being exploited because we're sharing what we know, but also it protects our warfighters on the battlefield. So it's this virtuous cycle of a relationship with a company back here, left of the threat. So when we deploy, we're not living with those vulnerabilities in reality.
One thing I was going to mention, over the years, we at Oak Ridge National Lab and the U.S. Department of Energy partnered with mainly the chip manufacturers. And in 2019, Secretary Perry came to Oak Ridge with Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA. And Jensen said he actually had 4 bets on the company at that time. I'm sure he had more now. But 2 of them were with Oak Ridge National Lab at the time. One of them to do double precision on the GPUs, and the other one to do error correction. So I think we, like the government or its labs and our universities, we're good really at partnering because we're really innovators and we can actually transition, these solutions to the companies. We do the same thing today with the utilities, but I really believe, the sense of urgency and the size of a scope that we're facing today requires a little different thinking about partnerships and how do we create new ecosystems for innovations, and the role of our universities, and the role of our labs, the role of the government, and the role of the companies. I think if we continue on the same path, we will not be able to outpace the adversaries. We need a new framework of thinking about these partnerships.
Hey, so please go ahead. Just to underscore what Mo said, and that's what we're thinking, we've thought about at Cybercom. Inside of the Cyber National Mission Force, we have an organization that is focused on just that. So you heard Morgan talk about, and General Hawk talk about the thousands of companies that we're partnered with. On the military side, we have partnerships with specific companies discreetly to get after, hey, how do we do this differently, 1v1 with the companies? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's probably a meme or a myth out there that there are people in the government who don't really understand new technologies, and that's a barrier to adoption here. And I don't think that has been anyone's experience in the area I'm in. I think people feel like a lot of people in the government and national security really get the new technologies. That being said, I'd be lying if it was, and I'm not speaking for my company, I'm speaking for kind of the tech industry more broadly. I'd be lying if I said it's just as easy to work with the national security customers as it is to work with Walmart. And I think that that's not just because of bureaucracy, that's not just because of sales cycles. There's bespoke technology requirements for a tech or SaaS company to work with a government customer. And so I do think those are, that might be an area where an adversary might have an asymmetrical advantage where they can work more swiftly to integrate, as Robyn said, new technologies into what they do.
I think this is a great pivot to AI. Which is a place where private sector is, we talk about the geopolitics of AI all the time, but the truth is that it's going to be driven by private sector. It is, the advances in AI are not going to be driven by governments. Thompson, this is what you do for a living. What are the core concepts for thinking about AI risk and opportunities, especially with respect to cyber warfare?
I think there's a few concepts that really lean into here. One is an idea, the concept of scaling laws. And scaling laws refers to a research paper that was put out 4 years ago, January 2020, actually authored by a few of the co-founders of Anthropic, where I work. And it's this idea that even without any kind of targeted additional innovation, if you just throw more data, and into a bigger model, those models become exponentially more intelligent. And when they become more intelligent, we actually don't know how intelligent they will be or in what new ways they will be intelligent. Those new capabilities reveal themselves to us once the model is trained, which is pretty scary. And I'll add on top of this, the scaling laws are accelerating even more so because we are adding targeted innovations on top of those model trainings. So hardware is getting better. Algorithms are getting better. We're getting smarter in how to use data. So you're just adding these multiplier effects. Neil, you mentioned compounding effects of technology earlier. That is happening aggressively in frontier large language models. And so I think about, just to get a sense of how fast this is progressing, I think about a legal tech CEO I was having lunch with recently. He was trying to get a sense of what to expect from how fast these models are improving in terms of intelligence. And I said, imagine, last year's models being like a college intern. And this year's models being like a 1L or a 2L at law school. Maybe next year or the year after, the model will be like a fourth-year associate at a law firm. And maybe in a couple years, it'll be a partner at Sullivan & Cromwell. And human intelligence is not the limit on these models. So it just keeps going upwards after that. And this is happening very, very rapidly. In terms of what these models are good at, they're good at knowledge work. So anything a human can do at a computer. And that doesn't mean just at a laptop. If computers control a helicopter, then they'd be good at that too, right? But it's anything a human can do at a computer. One of the first areas of knowledge work that appears to be taking off, and one of the first areas we saw product market fit in LM technology in the market was coding, right? It was GitHub Copilot that really took off as very clean, clear product market fit. And so as you think about cyber warfare, this is an area where models are getting better, faster, sooner on this exponential curve that we're seeing. And so I think there's a lot of issues to grapple with there, and we don't have a lot of time to grapple with them.
How do we deal with the defensive and offensive implications of this, right? So how do we get as good at anticipating the counter threats, and how do we ensure responsible deployment?
I may look to you all for that.
So I would say on the defensive and offensive capabilities utilizing AI, it's really a cat and mouse thing, right? Okay, so both are advancing, and to Tom's point, with AI, you're able to do a lot bigger scales and larger scales, and so you're improving on the accuracy and so on. But I think the big thing in my mind is if you want to deploy something in the field, you want to make it operational, you need to have assurances that actually it works, it's responsible, explainable, trustworthy, right? And so there's a lot of research that needs to be done and a lot of work that needs to be done to get to that stage. And I realize, the discussion we had earlier saying, well, China would do A, will deploy B, but I think in our case, I think it behooves us, to put our minds together and look at assured AI. So we need to do a lot of test and evaluation and be able to explain, the results. I think our soldiers or whoever is not going to use these capabilities in the field unless they trust actually that we're going to do the right thing. And I think that's important.
So Mo, to your point about operating at the speed of trust, I think it's yes, and we have to do both, right? Right now, you can use an AI, large language model, and troll the internet, and you can look for 0 days, and you can employ them. That's what, that's what we're seeing on the malicious cyberspace, right? There's so many ways where these ransomware brokers can find exploits and detonate them, or nation states can use them. And so the question for us is, how do we fight the now, which is enable our defenders and our operators to leverage the technology to be able to defend against these capabilities that have that our adversaries are using now, and at the same time, we need to be able to think, how do we make that next generation leap in the technologies, and let the industry help us do that. So at the end of the day, you've got to be able to do both. We've got to protect civil liberties. We've got to, operate in accordance to our norms and values. But at the same time, the expectation is that, we should be able to, if you think about, ransomware, the ransomware ecosystem, if you think about the exploits that you can generate using this technology, we have to be able to contest this kind of activity from malicious cyber actors. And so I think the answer is twofold. You've got to move now, but you've also got to make sure that we balance against the things that we value.
I was just going to add that, one thing that really worries me is the, potential for generative AI to create information operations capabilities for adversaries, and I live in a world where the more cowbell ring is happening constantly, and there's just not enough folks working in government who will be able to scour the internet and analyze all of the potential nor do we want the government to be doing that, I think, but potential disinformation models that may be generated covertly by a foreign nation. And I really think I would encourage Vanderbilt and other academic private sector entities that hold public trust to become centers of excellence for providing that kind of analysis, trusted analysis to the American public, to the the global community in some respects, to be able to fill in those gaps. It's not really a public-private partnership issue as much as we're all living in the same informational ecosystem. Government can't do everything, and these models and capabilities will offer opportunity for malevolent use by some, and the ability to assess that and provide trusted information to the public on a timely basis is just a critical capability that I think the private sector and academia is well positioned to support.
Nilo, can I just say, so I talked about a little bit about the dark side, but this enables us to also move fast. And so there is a lot of capability where we're looking at using this to enable our workforce to, the mundane tasks, let's let the technology do the mundane tasks so we can do the varsity level work. And so it's a balanced conversation that we're trying to have about how do we leverage, everything, there's a dark side to everything. So how do we optimize around the opportunities, and where the technology also offers us opportunities to get after the bad actors, we're going to take those too. But again, right now, at least, we're not in the corner in a fetal position with an abacus, right? There's opportunity here, and it's partnerships like this that enables us to be able to, not just this, but with our allies and partners who are thinking the same thoughts. They share the same values we do, and my money is on us that we're going to come up with a solution.
I think that's extremely well said from where I sit as well. With the introduction of any new powerful technology, there are benefits and adverse impacts too, right? And I think the opportunities of this technology are extremely exciting to leverage in national security and elsewhere, of course. Drug discovery, scientific research. There's so many applications where instead of one postdoc or clinician working on something, you can have 100 and working faster, right, with AI. I think another piece to be optimistic about is America is in the lead right now. And that actually gives us some breathing room to figure out how to do this responsibly and to how to kind of prevent the worst outcomes of this. We're not neck and neck with an adversary right now, and we should take advantage of this lead to do it right.
All right, we've been getting some questions in, so I want to honor the audience and throw these questions out to anyone who wants to answer them. First one's on Volt Typhoon, was a demonstration of PRC cyber capabilities. The panel members also described how it was a galvanizing call to action for the U.S. cybersecurity apparatus. Because of this, do you think Volt Typhoon was counterproductive for the PRC? In this vignette, is there such a thing as cyber strategic deterrence as traditionally defined? What a great question. Who asked that? No.
Yeah, from our perspective, Volt Typhoon was galvanizing not just inside the U.S. government, but as we worked with partners, not only inside the United States, but our allies. With regard to the second part of the question, did they fire this capability too early? Who knows, right? But what we do know, and you heard earlier today from Morgan, they've doubled down, right? China's doubled down. They're developing new capabilities. And so it's incumbent upon us, to ensure that they don't have the advantage. It's what can we collectively do to make sure our systems, we do, the defense work is, it's not cool, it's not easy. But what are the things that we can do now, knowing what we know, because we'll give you the IOCs, the indicators of compromise. We'll tell you what we know as soon as we know it. We'll make sure that those TTPs are shared at the unclass level. I don't know that we have the mechanisms, to Mo's point, to be able to share where it matters in some of these sector risk management areas that are like in the ICS space and the IoT space, right? So we've got a ton of work to do there.
So maybe just a quick comment. Sometimes I tend to think about collateral damage, associated with events like this. And, you may intend to do something, you release something in the wild, you're going to get something unintended, target something unintended. And I'm not sure, with China, what's their tolerance to, collateral damage, given what we know about their infrastructure and things of that nature. So that's maybe
I was going to push on that a little bit because, Robyn, you said earlier that the Russians don't really care about collateral damage. And, historically, their cyber operations were kind of like drunken sailors leaving fingerprints everywhere. I may not use a sailor analogy, but the Chinese...
I take no offense, I'm a Marine, but I hang with sailors.
It's like drunken infantry people leaving fingerprints everywhere. Thompson, you spent time there. What is the Chinese mindset? Like, how are they likely to react to being discovered?
It'll be really interesting to see how history reflects on the Xi Jinping era in CCP politics. There's three really compelling dates in the arc of U.S.-China relations, really from the Chinese side. 1972, they shift to a more pro-engagement, and then 1980, reform and opening posture where they want friendly relations with the U.S. so that they can develop their economy, get technology, get investment, and so on, have access to the international economic order. In 1989, there's another pivot. I'm citing Rush Doshi's research, by the way, who's on a panel tomorrow. In 1989, there's another pivot where the Soviet Union falls, which was kind of earth-shattering to the CCP leadership. They see the Gulf War and how far ahead the U.S. is. And the Tiananmen massacre happens, and they start to view the U.S. as kind of an existential threat to CCP leadership. And then fast forward, but again, they start this kind of blunting strategy against U.S. power, but they're still very friendly. And so we're just a developing country, we want to be friends with everyone, including the U.S., and it's kind of this hide your strengths and bide one's time approach that Deng Xiaoping championed. In 2009, we see another shift with the financial crisis, and suddenly some hubris starts to sneak in. Wow, U.S. doesn't know that much. These Western experts don't know so much. And this kind of bravado comes into Chinese foreign policy. And I think we continue to see that. And it feels like it's led to a lot of unforced errors, frankly. Because I think it's tougher for China to get what they want in international relations the more they show this aggressive behavior and kind of anger potential or their international partners.
Just to add on, the erudite questioner mentioned deterrence theory. I think what other panelists have said about this motivating increased U.S. government collaboration amongst ourselves and with the private sector, it enhances deterrence by denial as we continue to shore up our cybersecurity. Yes, there's a lot of work to be done, but shining a public spotlight on what they have done to the extent, I am not able to measure how that affects the Chinese leadership's calculus, but I can say what it has done on our side, and I think there is a cost that they are paying for that insofar as the investments that we're making and the collaboration that it's further generating.
We have a question about open source that I'd like to pose to the panel. The world ducked a catastrophic bullet when a Microsoft engineer accidentally detected an implant in a ubiquitously deployed component of Linux. Do you view open source software as an ongoing attack vector in spite of assurances that eyes on make it more secure than closed source alternatives? And a corollary to that is, what about open source LLM models? Do they have a leveling effect? Are we worried about them? So either side of that.
Should I start? An LLM in its rawest form is what we call helpful only, which means it'll help you do anything, good or bad. It will help you, write a paper, a news article. It will help you research cancer cures. It will also help you cheat on your homework. It will help you develop a bioweapon, right? It's called helpful only. And so a lot of what we do when we're building in safety measures to these models is we're making them harmless as well. So helpful and harmless. With an open source model, you can fine tune that harmlessness out of the model, right? And I think that's what a lot of the concerns people have about open source models are. On top of that, it can help a company or some other organization accelerate their LLM development because they have access to an open source model that they have not developed themselves. So I do think there's an acceleration effect with companies or adversaries that might not be as far ahead. And there's also this risk we inject with more risky models out there.
I would say AI can be a great tool to try and to scan these open source codes and to figure out if we have any vulnerabilities in them. And I think that's, the area of cognitive cyber, where you have AI and cybersecurity together to look at codes and what is implanted in these codes and what not. I think it's really dangerous to use an open source code these days without knowing what's in it.
Yeah, I think there's a value proposition. Well, there's an argument to be made that, that development ecosystem has to be thriving and well, right, to be able to enable us to move fast. But we've got to develop constructs to be able to assure, to gain a surety on the code, right? So, if you go into an Apple environment, you got an SDK, and you know that there's a level of security around that. When you think about modern conflict, if there's a code that's built on open source architecture, just think about, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Hamas, some of those applications are used to notify a nation about whether it's a weapon strike that's coming their way. So how do you understand the efficacy of that software, that it's not exploited by an adversary? So we've just got to be able to figure out the mechanisms. Like if you own the repository, do you have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that the code that's uploaded there's a mechanism to assure security? I think that's just work that we can do, again, with the smart minds around this to be able to assure the environment.
One last question. Can the U.S. leverage information operations to counter Chinese influence? Is it a priority today? What are the risks of doing I/O against a near-peer adversary?
So what we're seeing is today, information operations is a part of the lexicon. It's a part of modern life, right? It's not isolated to what we saw in Russia, Ukraine. Every day on social media, we have nation-state actors who own personas whose sole intent is to influence domestic audiences. And so, the question becomes, how do we deter or deny them the capability to do that? And that's a ton of work that we have to do across the U.S. government to understand where those actors are, whether it's nation state or otherwise, where those actors are influencing us, and how do we build a resilience in our people to be able to understand how and where they're being influenced. And that starts not just, in the adult population. It has to start really early, at elementary, middle, and high school, as we're beginning to consume the technologies and consume, we're being influenced by these constructs.
So we're almost out of time. I want to end on a positive note and ask each of you the same question. What are we doing well? What do we need everyone out here to do to support the mission? And what role do academic institutions like Vanderbilt have in developing the right talent, the right technology, and contributing to the mission from a broader perspective?
I think, first of all, Vanderbilt is a great university. It's one of the core universities, running Oak Ridge National Lab. So we're looking forward to partnering with Vanderbilt, but I think, like the general earlier this morning talked about, Vanderbilt can lead the way in building a new curricula that actually is relevant, to the armed forces, to cybersecurity. I think, trying to educate, U.S. citizens about cybersecurity, building the right programs for them, it's extremely important. I think we need to always worry about, insider threats, and I think to Jamal's earlier point, Let's bring everybody, but I think we really need to work hard on trying to train and put the right curricula in place, right, and excite people about mission. And I think that's important to start early, and I think Vanderbilt can lead the way.
I agree with everything Mo said. I would say that all technology creates opportunities and challenges, and I think the individual human unit of analysis is actually, we talk about weapon systems and critical infrastructure and whatnot, but the individual also is very important in the equation, and so all of us are part of, something you can do is to minimize the vulnerabilities that we collectively need to potentially address. I think to Mo's point, just building on, I've been in federal service as a career civilian now for my 14th year, and before that I was at a national lab, but there's no competition here on this stage. But I would encourage students and would look forward to, throughout my career I have engaged with students. Government is an exciting place to be where you are living history on the day-to-day, and we need the best minds, the best people, whether you're wearing a uniform or you're a civilian like me, or you're working with government at an academic institution or in a private sector company. We need to work together to win the century.
So for me, two things. We all have battle space, right? At home, you have a battle space in cyberspace, that's terrain that you need to defend. I'll leave you with an anecdote. I was with one of our young officers, talking to a group of young folks, and about the importance of the people that we have in the United States, and as we work with our allies, and the righteousness of, how do you get motivated, because we can't pay you enough to do this mission. And he said to this group of folks, of young people, he's like, look, this mission, where else do I get to hack on behalf of my nation and don't end up in jail? So, you can come to the Cyber National Mission Force. We're looking for a few good men. But again, the point there is everybody has a fiduciary responsibility to protect your battle space. And then when you're done doing that, come help us protect the collective, right?
I'm sold. I'll double down this message that we're in the lead right now, and this is all moving extremely fast, but we have more time because we're winning than we were if we were losing to figure out how to get this right. And I think it's going to take a very multidisciplinary approach, and I love, especially as a Nashville native, that Vanderbilt is leading in that here. But it's going to take a very multidisciplinary approach in universities, in government, in industry. We're recruiting people from national security to our company, right? Like, we want to get this right, but it's going to...
Don't recruit too many.
Yeah, sure. It's going to take a lot of different disciplines and kinds of expertise to get this right, and we don't have a lot of time.
Thank you. Thank you all for engaging in this conversation. We could go on for another hour or two. There's a whole bunch of topics we didn't hit, but why don't we just give a round of applause to our panelists.